Hey gang, this week's episode is brought to you by oldschoolshirts.com. Hey, check them out. You like defunct teams and leagues and t-shirt form? Well, you'll find them there, but a whole bunch of other stuff too. Do you remember a radio station of the past or perhaps a mall that you used to go to? All kinds of great cultural and sports memories can be found at the great folks at oldschoolshirts.com. Promo code GOODSEATS for 10% off all of your purchases. And now, here's our show.
Welcome to the Yankee Stadium in the heart of New York for England's second match in the American Bicentennial Tournament. This is America's most famous baseball stadium, where the legendary Babe Ruth made his name, Joe DiMaggio too, recently remodeled at a cost of £50 million, 55,000 seats there, the home of the New York Yankees, who indeed have played 5 baseball games here already this week. The last of them only 24 hours ago. You can see it's a football pitch with a difference as England now face Italy in front of probably the biggest crowd they've had in this stadium this week. Two nations, of course, who will come face to face in World Cup qualifying games in the coming months. Let's catch up on the two teams. The England side, of course, they lost to Brazil last Sunday, most unluckily in Los Angeles. But 7 changes now from that side. No Kevin Keegan, who's being rested, and in fact has joined us in the commentary box today. No Jerry Francis, no Ray Clements, amongst others. First caps for goalkeeper Jimmy Rimmer of Arsenal, for Ray Wilkins, the 19-year-old Chelsea skipper, and Gordon Hill, the dynamic young player of Manchester United. As for Italy now, one change from the side that beat America by 4-0. The Italian side then with fullback Moreno Roggi at number 2. Otherwise, no, they've got Tardella there. In fact, it's Roggi who, in fact, will be playing at number 2. It's a side that is filled with great experience. Italy, in fact, have won their last 2 games against England, both in 1973. 2 of those players have been around since the 1970 World Cup. That fabulous goalkeeper there's Dino Zoff, who came into the side just after that tournament. And their skipper and number 6, the sweeper, Facchetti. So it's after a day in which the temperatures have been into the 80s in New York. A pleasant evening and a great evening for Jimmy Rimmer, playing his first game for England at the age of 28. He says, whatever happens to me now, they can never take that away from me. England will be in the white shirts, attacking the goal to our right. So Jimmy Rimmer goes down to his end, and it will be Dino Zoff who has all the problems in the goal mouth at the other end, which includes the baseball diamond, and goodness knows how the ball is going to bounce off that.
Welcome to Good Seats Still Available, a curious little podcast devoted to exploring what used to be in professional sports. Here's your host, Tim Hanlon.
My goodness. Well, hello there, fellow defunct sports enthusiasts, and of course, our soccer nerds out there. It is Good Seats Still Available. My name is Tim Hanlon. I'm your humble and congenial host. It is our little weekly sojourn into what used to be in professional sports, and we thank you for finding us. Lots of choices out there, and we are honored to have you for a few minutes time in your earbuds this week. We revert back to our one of our favorite sports, soccer, of course. And so this is a really interesting conversation with our guest this week, Simon Turner, author of the brand new book. It's called Tinpot, Football's Forgotten Tournaments. And Tinpot is sort of a colloquial way to sort of refer to the myriad of shall we say, concocted tournaments and championships and cups, if you will, in the realm of soccer over the many, many decades of its historical life. And the notion of Tinpot basically being the artificiality of such things. And lots of interesting forgotten tournaments and the stories behind them are in this book. And it hit my radar in particular because as many of our listeners have heard me say over the many years, I've been a soccer fan for a long time, since the mid to late 1970s, back when there was this thing called the North American Soccer League, the NASL. And while that, of course, is no longer with us, some very interesting overlaps in this book to these sort of Tinpot Cups, these tournaments that were sort of came and went and are lost in the dustbins of history, and that come across into the United States and North America and have some really interesting, some overlaps. So as cultural phenomena that might have been here in the States, but certainly to soccer fans of a certain age too here. And we talk about a couple of those things, which I think are just really fascinating, including what you just heard in that clip to get us going this week. If you were around in 1976, you will remember, perhaps, this thing that was concocted by various soccer aficionados called the Bicentennial Cup. And of course, 1976 being the 200th birthday and celebration of our nation's history. But as a setup, what you heard there was the beginnings of, or the lead in to one of the marquee matchups of that tournament that occurred from May 23rd through the 31st of May, 1976, amongst four teams. And the two excuses really for setting this tournament up, he says, in the first place, was the fact that England and Italy, the two national teams thereof, in 1976 had both failed to qualify for the European Championship that summer. So they were these two sort of top-tier teams, and legendary ones at that, with huge fan bases all around the world, as well as in their actual origin countries, of course, were kind of idled and didn't have much sort of to do during the summer. So why not bring in the United States and put them in a tournament? Let's make this thing up. Let's add Brazil, obviously a well-known and very successful national team as well. And we'll create this other thing called Team America. I think it was also called Team USA, or some other sort of lots of different names sort of associated with this club, which was really, if anything, not even a team. It was really more of a hodgepodge of players mostly playing in the North American Soccer League at the time, which essentially carried the United States label or banner in this tournament. And again, we're talking about major international figures that actually played for national teams either prior to or maybe even during around this time, that were sort of quote unquote labeled as American, a Team America. And no slouch, this team. Bobby Moore, Ramon Mifflin, Mike England, Giorgio Canaglia, and the legendary Pelé were just some of the big names that were part of this Team America club. No issue, though, because they finished fourth, this Team America. They lost all their games in this tournament. But this tournament was a fascinating sort of a glimpse into international big-time soccer, which we take for granted today. The game you heard that clip from, and the dulcet tones of the legendary Robert Merrill on the announcing, if you could hear that in the background, and the organ music and stuff, was at Yankee Stadium. And this is on May 28th, between a highly anticipated England versus Italy match. And it was a really good one. There were more than 40,000 people in attendance. And England bested Italy after Italy took a 2-0 lead, 3-2 on this summer afternoon. And but is it really a fascinating kind of thing to sort of understand this little tournament? We'll talk about this Bicentennial Cup tournament. It was in places like RFK Stadium in Washington, and the Yale Bowl in New Haven, the JFK Stadium when it was there in Philadelphia, the LA Memorial Coliseum. I think the Kingdome even had a game during this little series. So we're going to talk about that with Simon, but also some other really interesting U.S. related tournaments as well. The 1992, 1993 U.S. Cup, which was this thing that was manufactured to create some games for the United States national team in the wake of being awarded the 1994 World Cup. Fascinating stories in that too, with some major clubs that came into kind of, as prep, what we call friendlies, in anticipation of the big 1994 World Cup. And even a really fascinating story about This thing in the UK, in England in particular, from the 1980s, which you major indoor soccer league and indoor soccer aficionados will enjoy, called the Soccer Six or the Soccer Sixes, which was a mid-season, mostly during the holidays, during the break, normally when clubs were playing in what was the prior Division One, now known as Premier League, indoor game, basically replicating much, not all, but much of the major indoor soccer league and NASL indoor soccer goings on in a little tournament there that folks like Guinness and others were sponsors to. And we're talking about the major clubs at that time playing indoors in the UK. And it was a fascinating time and lost, I think, frankly, to history. While there might be some British fans out there that remember these games, I'm not sure many US MISL and NASL indoor fans even knew that the indoor game was being played abroad. And you wonder if there could have been some collaboration during those years. So we get into all of that kind of stuff with our guest this week, Simon Turner. He, the author of Tinpot, Football's Forgotten Tournaments from the Anglo-Italian to Zenith Data Systems Cup. And we talk about all kinds of cups, like the Intertoto Cup and the Anglo-Italian Cup. And I give him some stick for some things that I think could be in the next edition. For example, the International Soccer League of the early 1960s, et cetera, here in the United States. Fascinating conversation. And we're going to get into the U.S. Cup, the Bicentennial Cup, and the Soccer Sixes tournaments, among other things, in a moment's time. You can get a copy of this book. It is just released from our friends at Pitch Publishing, wherever you get good books. But you could, of course, go to our website at goodseatsstillavailable.com. Search up this episode number 368 with our pal Simon Turner, and you will find a convenient couple of links to get the paperback or Kindle versions of said book. And you'll learn some of the details that we're going to get into in our conversation now. So here we go. This is a chat we had a few weeks back in anticipation of the release of this book. And here's our chat with Simon that hopefully you'll enjoy as much as I did. Sit back, please, and as always, enjoy. You're talking to a guy who grew up as wait for it, an American soccer fan back in the 1970s, okay? When there were maybe a handful of them, but this North American Soccer League thing, the New York Cosmos in particular, where I grew up, hit my radar at a very impressionable age. And in two things. Number one, a lifelong passion for soccer / football, which we'll talk about. But number two, it set in motion sort of all these teams and leagues that sort of went away because, as you know, right, the NASL just vanished by the mid-'80s, and the U.S. had its moments. But I'm fascinated by the topic of your book. Let's have some background about you and what came into your mind as give us an insight as to why you pursued this topic, because it's really fascinating to me. It's almost a European version, at least in soccer, of some of the things that we love to obsess about here, things that are forgotten and maybe had little to no worthiness, but are probably important to remember nonetheless.
Sure. So I think in terms of Tinpot, I think a lot of football competitions have been around for a long time. So over here in England, the FA Cup, it's been going since 1872. The Football League, that's been played since 1888. The World Cup, that's been around since 1930, so it's coming up to its centenary. So these are the success stories, the competitions that have just lasted. And what I'm really interested in Tinpot are those tournaments that didn't succeed. They burst into life. They had their moment in the sun, and then they disappeared. And those are the ones that I'm interested in. The tournaments that have lived fast and died young, if you like. Those are the ones that
why though?
In the book.
Yeah, why though? And why do you call it Tinpot? Is that a term that is known in other circles on the other side of the pond here, or just curious as to where that term comes from too?
Sure. So that may be something that's peculiar to England. So in England, Tinpot is a fairly derogatory term, to be honest with you. If football fans, if they want to denigrate a rival club, they will often call them Tinpot because it's a way of saying a club is quite small, it's quite amateurish. Um, Tinpot has that meaning. And then also in England, another word for a trophy is a pot. Instead of saying, you've won a trophy, you might say you've won a pot. So it's a play on words. It's talking about tournaments which, from the outside, may not look all that impressive, may not, certainly don't have the stature of the FA Cup or the Football League or the World Cup or what have you. But actually, in my mind, they have their own charm. And I think they're perfect for a book in a way, because every book needs a beginning, a middle, and an end. And that's what all these tournaments have. They all have a beginning, a middle, and an end. There was some reason why they were created in the first place. Obviously, they took place for a number of years, and then for for various different reasons, they all disappeared. And it's interesting to work through the history of a particular tournament and work through its full lifespan, rather than with, say, the Premier League or World Cup or any other tournament that continues to this day. You can only ever tell the story up until now.
So, because why? Because and I'm going to guess, because having read through and obviously obsessed about some of the areas that we'll talk about that have U.S. Influence, either on the ground or in the case of Soccer 6 indoor stuff, which is arguably a U.S. invention. Is it because it also kind of mimics and rhymes, if you will, or is an important but maybe not focused on thread of the history of the game itself as professional leagues come and go, mature, the money and all that kind of stuff? These cups kind of evolve with it.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I think they do have their own charm. And I think they do tell you a fair bit about football history, because sure, you learn a bit by talking about the major tournaments. But when you start investigating tournaments that were created for a particular reason, a particular point in time, there's always a story behind that. There's a reason why the competition was created, and there was a reason why it then disappeared. And I think that's what gives these tournaments their interest, really, because they're often forgotten about. People don't talk about them very much, and therefore, when you start researching them, you find out all sorts of information which you never previously aware of. I mean, a number of the competitions in the book, I sort of vaguely remember or have heard about, but I certainly didn't know the background and the detail and what happened. And then, once you start reading about these tournaments, they have they have a life of their own, and it's a fascinating process to find out about all these all these tournaments and why they existed and why they disappeared.
All right, before I start grilling you on some of the U.S. and North American flavored ones, and frankly also a few of the ones that maybe we suggest for your second edition, sure. Can you give us a sense of maybe a quintessential tin pot cup or two that in Europe perhaps might be either fondly or oddly remembered, that persists for some example, something that maybe stood out, either something that you kind of generally knew about and learned about, or that just completely surprised you, that came and went?
I think one of the tournaments that is quite fondly remembered was the Anglo-Italian Cup, and the reason I choose that one was because it had two iterations, if you like. It was held for the first time in the early 70s, 1970 through to 73. So they had four tournaments. It was a very simple tournament, held at the end of the season. Top clubs from England and Italy competed against each other, working their way through to a final. And then after 73, just disappeared, went away for best part of 2 decades, and then it came back in the early 90s, the 1990s. But when it came back in the 1990s, it was a slightly different. It was the same tournament, but it was instead of being for the clubs in, whereas Italy would be Serie A and in England in the Premier League, they took it from the level below, so Championship in England and Serie B in Italy. So what you've got is a lot of fans of different clubs who remember this tournament for different reasons. So if you're a fan of some of the top clubs in England, you may well remember them competing in the Anglo-Italian Cup in the 70s. Whereas you're a fan of a team that's generally in the Championship, then you may well remember them competing in the Anglo-Italian Cup in the 1990s. So quite a lot of English clubs have competed in that tournament over the years. And I think, you asked about a quintessential Tinpot tournament. I think that is one because there is nothing else like it really in certainly in English football. There's never been an Anglo-German Cup or an Anglo-Spanish Cup or an Anglo-French Cup as such. There's only ever been this sort of competition between domestic clubs in between England and Italy, yeah, I think that certainly meets the definition of a quintessential Tinpot tournament.
But okay, so but why why that particular dynamic, that duality between an Anglo-Italian Cup versus some of those others? Because now, frankly, with all due respect, I mean, in the world of private equity and big business and money and all that kind of stuff, yes, there's clearly fixture congestion these days. But to me, that sounds like a business opportunity where you take two individual country professional leagues and maybe have them square off with each other, especially if there's some organic disdain between the two countries and the two nations. But why these two in particular? I mean, was it a money thing? Was it a sponsor somehow that sort of came together? I'm just curious as to why this particular comet, so to speak.
So I think there's different reasons for the two different iterations of the tournament. So if you take the first one that was held in the early 1970s, I think it came about on the back of a number of different competitions between England and Italy. So as well as international fixtures between England and Italy, one of the things that took place in the 1960s was they had a number of interleague matches. So basically, the English league would pick a side from all the players playing in England, and it didn't matter whether they were English, they could be Scottish or Welsh or Irish. And similarly, Italy, they would pick their teams from players playing in Serie A. So again, you had players coming from Argentina or Brazil or Sweden or whatever. So it was the two leagues that competed against each other. So they had a number of those types of matches. So already the sort of the links between the two leagues were there because they organised these one-off matches, which were really just a trial of strength, really, between the two leagues. And then what then happened is there was another competition in England called the League Cup, which is a sort of second one down from the FA Cup. And in the late 60s, it was won by a small club called Swindon Town. And because they were so far down the league, they weren't, even though they won the League Cup, they beat Arsenal in the final. They weren't allowed to compete in European competition because the rules at that time precluded a club from competing in European competition if they weren't in the top two divisions. So what happened was, obviously, this was very unfair on Swindon. They won the League Cup, they'd earned a place in Europe, but they couldn't take that place. And what happened was that the English League obviously got in touch with their Italian counterparts and said, we need to do something for Swindon, basically. We need to, they can't compete in European competition. What can we do? So they had what was called the Anglo-Italian League Cup, which was a one-off final between Swindon Town, the winners of the League Cup, and the team that had won the Coppa Italia. And they competed in a one-off final for the glory of victory and nothing else. So that took place, and then the Anglo-Italian Cup came around the season after. So as to why it came about, it was a sort of a gradual building of relationships between the two leagues, different types of matches taking place between the two leagues, either representative matches from different clubs or club matches, and then on the back of that, the Anglo-Italian Cup was born. But then when you go through to the 1990s, it's a very different set of circumstances that give rise to the Anglo-Italian Cup coming back. And what you have in England at the start of the 1990s is the creation of the Premier League. Now, what happened was obviously the Football League found itself with 72 league clubs, but not the top ones anymore. And they had space in their calendar for more fixtures, and were looking around at, well, what can we do in terms of competitions, to differentiate ourselves from the Premier League? What competition can we hold that will be unique to the Football League, that will use some of our teams, that won't involve the Premier League teams? And they came up with the idea of bringing back the Anglo-Italian Cup. So different reasons for those competitions being created at different points in time.
Yeah, and that's the theme I certainly got through reading all of this, and I have I'm kind of I would say intermediate knowledge of the various European leagues. Certainly following and have my favorites in Serie A and the Bundesliga and Premier League and the like. But and where it's an embarrassment of riches now in the United States, finally, I guess, to have all access to those leagues and stuff versus say in the 1970s where it would be, I don't know, if we were lucky, we would get a monthly, World Soccer magazine that had all the scores and that kind of stuff. But it does speak to what I think is thematically comes out very quickly in this book, is the idea that the rationale behind these cups sometimes are almost an invented necessity in some respects. In this case, right, you're describing what is now a fourth division team, Swindon Town, God bless them, having a great season and having no place to go further in this, I think unique to association football, right? This idea of winners of leagues and competitions going on to further compete against other winners of leagues and cups and stuff. The Cups Winners' Cup, a great example, which as an American, right, was always this. I never understood the title of it, right? Wait a minute, you won a cup, and now we have the winners of the cups playing for another cup. I mean, it's just it just seems the logic of it seemed to be kind of comical sometimes. But in the setup and the history and the evolution of the sport professionally around the world, right? This idea of cups and winners of such cups competing for others to win yet another cup is not a foreign thing at all. It's a very sort of and frankly continues to this day.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you're quite right. I'd never, because these were competitions I've sort of grown up with. You mentioned the European Cup Winners' Cup. Competitions like that have always been around, and I'd never thought of it that way. But yeah, it is something that is quite unique to European competition. I suppose it's just an inevitable outcome of the sort of geography of Europe, really. Where you've got so many different leagues, all competing within a short, relatively small geographical area. So it's quite easy for those competitions to be created and to prosper. I mean, obviously the European competition started in the late 1950s when commercial air travel started to take off. So that was the sort of one of the main precursors to those competitions being created, was the fact that teams could get quite quickly across Europe to play games and then get back again for the weekend for the domestic fixtures.
Okay, so let's focus in on some of the ones that I circled earlier. And again, I apologize for the indulgence here, but I appreciate it because these are some competitions that fans of a certain age, especially in the United States and North America, right, would be familiar with, and maybe also kind of gets a real and luckily you've gone fairly deep on some of these. So let's maybe do these sort of in historical order. And the first one I'll sort of throw at you is this 1976 Bicentennial Cup. And I can set the stage for a second because people will remember that this is the time, 1976, where the North American Soccer League was really becoming actually a white-hot comet for a period of time. Pelé had joined the NASL in 1975. There were rumors rampant that people like George Best were coming over. Eusebio was over here. I mean, some of the world's best players were either here already or fancying themselves as doing so. And obviously in the United States, 1976 was the 200th anniversary of the country's founding. What a perfect opportunity to create a cup of soccer in the United States, literally out of whole cloth, out of nothing. Maybe a little bit of understanding of that. And frankly, the only YouTube videos that we see out there are from the BBC. So I think England in particular had some nominal interest in this competition.
Yeah, obviously you mentioned about the NASL. It sounds, Tim, like we're probably a similar age because I grew up watching football in the 1970s, obviously in England, and was very aware of what was happening in the US with the NASL. Because in all the sort of football magazines I would read as a kid, there were articles on Pele at New York Cosmos and Rodney Marsh at Tampa Bay Rowdies, and obviously Johan Cruyff was over there, and you mentioned Eusebio. It just seemed incredibly glamorous, I have to say, as a kid in England, watching what was going on in America. And it was a fascinating time. But yeah, the USA Bicentennial Cup, that was obviously a one-off tournament to obviously celebrate the founding of the nation, and they organised a sort of celebratory football tournament, soccer tournament, and they invited some of the best teams in the world. So Brazil and Italy took part. They contested the World Cup final just 6 years earlier, and so England were invited, who'd won the World Cup 4 years before that. So some of the world's top international teams were there. And you mentioned about the BBC being interested. I mean, these were full internationals for England. Playing Brazil and Italy and what have you. So there was a lot of interest in England in how England would get on.
But it was also interesting too because England and Italy had nothing to do that summer because they hadn't qualified for the European Championship, right? So that probably became a convenient excuse for adding them to Brazil and this, we'll talk about in a second, this quote unquote Team America thing.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it was sort of both for Italy and England. It was a difficult time for both nations in terms of their international sides. They'd both done very well in previous years. So I mentioned about Italy runners-up in the 1970 World Cup, but they didn't do very well in the 74 World Cup, and then didn't qualify for the European Championships in 76. Similarly, England. Quarterfinal winners in 1966, quarterfinalists in 1970, but then failed to qualify for the World Cup in 74, and then again failed to qualify for the European Championships in 76. So yeah, you're right. Both teams were sort of kicking their heels that summer. So obviously opened the door for a trip to America.
You do mention this, but I think it's also important to understand this. So Team America was this. So the serial comic part of all this is these were a handful of matches played in largely in the Northeast in the United States, and Team America was the fourth entry besides Brazil, Italy, and England. And I guess the concoction was designed to be, in essence, what Team America was not the U.S. national team. The others were national teams ostensibly, but instead a melting pot, if you will, of players from the NASL that from various nationalities, right? So you had Pele, right? Obviously of Brazilian descent, not a naturalized American, certainly Giorgio Canaglia, who had just come into the New York Cosmos in 1976 and was not yet naturalized as a U.S. citizen as he would ultimately become. And astonishingly, Bobby Moore, who was British, right, and a legend from 1966's, but obviously was not part of the England national team at that point. Yet he was quote unquote part of Team America. So just arguably it's more like an NASL All-Star team than it was Team America. So I don't know. It just the tinniness of this pot already is in retrospect really cute, really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, obviously the USA international side wasn't particularly successful at around that time. So I think I mentioned the book. I think prior to this tournament, the USA's previous 16 matches, they'd lost all 16, and the most recent game was an 8-0 defeat to Mexico. So on the back of that sort of bad run of form, I think the last thing you probably would want to do is take on Brazil, Italy, and England. Sure, Italy and England may not have been had the greatest teams they ever had, but they were still top international sides. So if you'd have just played the normal American international side, I think it potentially could have been a bit embarrassing. But I think obviously they had this brilliant idea to go, well, we've got all these wonderful footballers that have come from all over the world to play in the NASL. So let's use them instead. Obviously there were American players in the side, but as you say, they put some of the NSL's top players into that side as well. Pele, Bobby Moore, and a number of others. And what it meant was that Team America became competitive. And whilst they didn't win any of the matches that they played in, they certainly weren't embarrassed in any of them, and were more than capable of taking on the Brazilians, Italians, and English.
Yeah, and it's interesting too, because as is certainly seen with earlier iterations of, say, the Intercontinental Cup and the FIFA World Club Cup or whatever, there's a lot of retroactive continuity, I guess, that sort of comes into this. And this competition, interestingly, I just read recently, I'm not sure if you covered this in here, but because from a historical perspective, right, the national teams of England and Italy were literally these were literally national teams. Brazil too, I think, but Team America wasn't really a national team, right? So there's some conjecture about sort of whether these statistics should be covered as a full international match, right? In the world of soccer, right, getting a cap, as an official nod for playing in a game in a legit international competition. I think FIFA in the early 2000s kind of went back, in particular for this competition, and said these games do not count as full internationals, largely because this Team America thing was this manufactured concoction.
Yeah, absolutely. There's always been that sort of question mark, and certainly from England's perspective, they've always treated the games against Brazil and Italy as full internationals. So full caps were awarded for those games, and then in the English records they will show as full internationals. But when they played Team America, they don't record that as a full international. They'll just record that as I don't know, whatever the next standing down is, but they don't recognise the game against Team America as a full international. So I suppose that was a compromise that they came up with.
All right, what's this? Oldschoolshirts.com. Fantastic. You've heard me talk on and on and on about the great folks and the great wares at oldschoolshirts.com. Like the name implies, it's old school and it's shirts, and they put them together, into what they call oldschoolshirts.com. It's like the name implies, but of course we love them primarily for their sports wear. You name the league of the past, you name the team of the past, the chances are huge that they're going to have more than one shirt and different color schemes for things that you may remember from the United Football League or the Major Indoor Soccer League or various flavors of the original XFLs, plural, or the Federal League perhaps, or maybe World Team Tennis, or maybe it was the North American Soccer League, and on and on and on. But hey, it's not just sports. It's also great cultural touchstones and memories from the past. How about the officially licensed Evel Knievel connection? How about collection? Yeah, that's what he's trying to say. Various colleges. How about dead malls of the past? Ice cream parlors, maybe even radio stations that you might remember. Hey, even there's a latest edition of the now old, Aloha Stadium commemorative shirt. All that kind of stuff and more. You will find at least a handful of shirts that you will just transport you back into your past, and you will amaze and impress your friends at the same time. It's oldschoolshirts.com, and we got a promo code for you, of course. Let's save you some dough while you go there, and its promo code is Good Seats. Good Seats. That's the promo code at oldschoolshirts.com. Promo code Good Seats for 10% off all of your purchases. Hey, P.F. Wilson and your friends at oldschoolshirts.com, thank you for your sponsorship of the show. And now, back to our conversation. Okay, so let's move on to the 90s now. And obviously, the aforementioned sort of abandonment, if you will, of the pro game, largely by the collapse of the NASL. And we've talked about this on many other episodes of this show, right? A very dark time for any American soccer fan in the mid to late 1980s and early 1990s. And I don't know, the miracle of the awarding of the World Cup for 1994, back in the early part of, I think it was 1989, I guess, where we received a notice, or 1990 perhaps, more than a glimmer of hope that perhaps a professional league and soccer could be resuscitated here. And part of that, right, was this 1990s thing called the U.S. Cup, right, which was ostensibly a men's tournament. Then it added a women's component, but the men's part of it really was this. I think part of the U.S.'s support, shall we say, and to buttress all the things that some of the infrastructure issues that were lacking as the United States was getting ready to host the World Cup in 1994. You want to give us a little bit of background on this U.S. Cup thing? This was a legit national team thing, and obviously designed to help the U.S. national team at least have some kind of sea legs for this tournament.
Yeah, absolutely. So it started in '92 and went on throughout the decade. And I think it was held every year, apart from the years when there was a World Cup, and obviously in '94 and '98, which obviously took priority. So it had a decent lifespan, the US Cup, and the one that I focus on in the book is the US Cup that was held in '93, obviously a year in advance of the World Cup.
Welcome back. As you can see, the teams are on the pitch at the Foxborough Stadium in Boston. Let's cross straight away to our commentary team of Rodney Marsh and Alan Parry.
Well, good evening, everyone, for what's suddenly become a very critical match for English football, and especially for Graham Taylor. And let's begin by having a look at the lineup that the England manager has selected tonight. 6 changes, 1 positional from the team beaten in Norway, and the new captain, of course, in Paul Ince. Des Walker and David Platt weren't considered after playing for their Italian clubs at the weekend. Platt, in fact, is injured, and Tony Adams and Paul Gascoigne aren't in the squad for this tournament. Teddy Sheringham is among the 11 named substitutes, any 4 of whom can be used, including a goalkeeper. Well, Carlton Palmer moves from midfield back into defence, and Nigel Clough gets the Gaza role between midfield and the strikers, one of whom is John Barnes, one of only 2 England survivors from the last team which played against the United States 8 years ago. The other one is Chris Woods, who in fact made his international debut in that game in Los Angeles, which England won by 5-0. And tonight, Woods wins his 43rd cap in England's goal. The American team shows 3 changes from that beaten by Brazil on Sunday, and they're strengthened by the return of 3 of their squad who play their football in Europe. Tab Ramos of Real Betis in Spain, and 2 from the German Bundesliga. Tom Dooley, and yes, that really is his name, he plays for Kaiserslautern, and Eric Winolda of Saarbrücken. The lineup includes 3 players familiar to English fans: goalkeeper Tony Meola, and of course John Harkes and Roy Wegerle.
Whereas the US had done well in the first US Cup in 1992, they won it. After that, things didn't go according to plan, really. 22 fixtures played following that victory, but they only won 3 of them. So obviously they came into the US Cup on the back of a very bad run of form, and they were up against, again, as in 1976, a very tough roster of opponents. So you had, again, a 4-team tournament. You have Germany, who were the reigning world champions. You had Brazil, who obviously, as we know now, went on to win the World Cup in '94. And then you had England, who finished 4th at the previous World Cup. So I don't think you could have a much tougher roster of opponents than that, really. So obviously it was a very tough set of games for the US, but England, even though they'd finished 4th at the previous World Cup, England were in quite a decline at the time, and went to America on the back of Some very poor performances. In particular, there were obviously England were in the middle of trying to qualify for the World Cup in '94, and I think were probably invited to America, assuming that everybody assumed that they probably would qualify, and England wanted to go to sort of see what it would be like when they got there 12 months later. But they were in a World Cup qualifying group with the Netherlands and Norway and Poland. It was a very tough group, and were really struggling. And just before they came to America for the US Cup in '93, they only managed to get a snatch of a very late draw away to Poland, and then lost to Norway. And by that stage, their World Cup qualification hopes were sort of dangling by a thread. They had I think they had 3 matches left at that stage, so they weren't out, but they were certainly up against it. And I tell you that because it just sort of sets the background to the match between the USA and England, because there was a lot of bad feeling at the time in England in terms of towards the manager of England and the team, because they were performing so poorly, and it did look as if we were going to miss out on the World Cup, which is a terrible thing to miss out on. And so going into a game against the USA, obviously, given the respective histories of the two nations in terms of soccer, England were expected to win, and as we know, we'll probably come on to, that didn't happen.
Now, we're talking June 9th, 1993. This was a game at the old Foxborough Stadium. And a reminder, these games are being played at large venues in the United States. I mean, Soldier Field in Chicago and the old RFK Stadium in D.C., and even the Pontiac Silverdome, which was a fully enclosed venue, right? And as FIFA was eager to determine whether they could play a quote-unquote indoor game with full grass, which England did wind up playing against Germany in the final game of this round robin tournament, losing to Germany 2-1. But this game against England, I mean, the U.S., I mean, the Sun had a great headline, Yanks 2, Planks nothing. When Alexi Lalas, who is a defender here in the United States, scores one of the goals against a full-side international team, you know that it wasn't a good day for England. U.S. won 2-0, and probably underscored the worst fears of the quality of this team that year for England.
Yeah. I mean, I do remember watching the match was shown live in England, and I remember watching it, and it was one of those games where US went 1 goal in front, and when there's only 1 goal in it, you think, well, we can get back into this. We can still get something from the game. But I do remember when, as you say, Alexi Lalas scored the second goal. It was a very poor goal for England to concede. It out-jumped the goalkeeper and at a corner. And as soon as that went in, my heart sank, because I knew what was coming. It seemed like England could play for 3 or 4 hours and they still wouldn't score. But there was still plenty of the match left after Lalas had scored, and just had to sit there and endure it and face the inevitable when they lost. And I think that was because Graham Taylor was England's manager at the time, and there were a number of low points over his reign. Some good times too, but there were some low points, and arguably the defeat to the USA was probably the lowest point in his reign as England manager in terms of disappointing defeats. I think there's certainly an argument for that. But interestingly, England did recover after that. The next game was against Brazil, and did rather wonder what was going to happen in that game. You're up against a team that obviously would go on to win the World Cup a year later, and having lost to the USA in such a disappointing fashion, you did wonder what the score was going to be. But England did manage to get a 1-1 draw in that game. So.
And was competitive, and was also competitive against Germany in that final game at the Silverdome in front of 62,000, falling to them at the end to a Klinsmann goal in the 55th minute. But still, but this is also, I mean, again, we talked about sort of competitions like this for the reasons, the rationale behind all of these things, or why these come into play or into being. This is arguably now what the Confederations Cup for FIFA does now with World Cup winning host countries, usually the year before. This indeed was a trial run, right? This was we had a lot riding on this in 1994 in the United States because this was the future of the sport in North America. FIFA knew that. Certainly the organizers in the United States knew that, right? So anything when it came to infrastructure, all of these stadiums were very much in the mix to be, with the exception of the Yale Bowl, I think, wound up becoming actual host venues for the 94 tournament and stuff. And frankly, the attendance at these games was terrific. So it really kind of showed, I think, FIFA and maybe allayed a lot of fears, maybe not the English national team and their qualification efforts, that the U.S. was capable and maybe, just maybe, might have some kind of success with this tournament, at least from a hosting perspective. And of course, it shattered all the records in terms of attendance and money and all that kind of stuff. So, but again, it lends credence to, these cups don't necessarily come out of thin air. There's usually something behind as to why these sort of things come up. And it wound up becoming very helpful for the U.S. national team to continue its preparation for further international tournaments and the like. And I suspect some of the other national clubs as well to come to the States and play here during the summer.
Yeah, I agree with everything you just said. I mean, I think there was this fear, certainly in Europe, before the '94 World Cup, because we knew the history of soccer in America. We knew that the NASL had this sort of glorious time in the sort of late '70s, and but then it disappeared, and nobody really could quite understand why. And we know that there are bigger sports in America than soccer. American football, as we would describe it in England, baseball. We know those are bigger sports, and there was this fear that the World Cup would be held in the US and in front of very small crowds. And obviously, the US Cup in '93, the attendances were superb, full stadiums. I think the average crowds were around 50,000. I mean, there's a huge attendances. And I think, I may be wrong on this, but I think the '94 World Cup is still the most attended World Cup of all time. And the US Cup in '93 showed, that was a trailblazer for what was coming with the World Cup the following year. So, and I think as well as the attendances, what it also showed was that the USA national side was going to be competitive. Obviously, as hosts, it was automatically awarded a place in the tournament, and you always want the host nation to do well because that always bodes well for a successful World Cup. And I think they did do well. Obviously, we've talked about the victory over England, perfectly well deserved. A defeat to Brazil, but only by 2-0, and then a narrow 4-3 defeat to Germany. So certainly the US national side, was able to demonstrate that it would be competitive at the World Cup, as they turned out to be.
All right, now for something completely different. Let's go back a decade into the 1980s, and I want to talk about this this thing known as Soccer 6. And the reason why it's really intriguing to soccer geeks and sports historian type nerds like me is this emanates out of something that was uniquely American at that time in the late 70s. And we've talked about this with one of the founders of this league and all kinds of other teams and stuff, this major indoor soccer league thing, right? So one of the things that was going on in the United States in the late 70s, early 80s, as the outdoor game was running out of gas, largely because of outrageous expectations and the money and importing of clubs and the inability to kind of support all that stuff, was this unique, innovation, I guess, of how to play the game indoors in an arena setting, off the boards, almost like a sort of a hockey-sized arena, very much more akin to what Americans are used to in terms of their sports, more exciting, a lot more physical, and borrowing elements of basketball and certainly hockey with 2-minute penalties and those kinds of things. And I will tell you, as a big fan of the indoor game here in the United States, I was almost clueless about the fact that there was this similar sort of, inspired tournament in the 1980s called Soccer 6 I know Guinness was a big sponsor for some time. Can you explain, and obviously you living there maybe have a much better understanding of this. Can you explain the beginnings of this there? And what this tournament or set of tournaments was when it was played, how similar it was to the MISL, all that kind of stuff. Because I see some of I will tell you, I go down on that rabbit hole on YouTube a lot, and I will tell you some of these games are I don't. The question is there, number one, how good was it? How seriously was it taken? And number two, I just can't believe the Americans and the English Football Association didn't think about competing against each other in some kind of, if you will, cup between the two of them.
Yeah, no, I mean, Soccer Six, it was sort of held in England throughout the 1980s. And certainly anybody who was a football fan in the 1980s, I think, has fond memories of Soccer Six, not least because it was broadcast, highlights were broadcast on the BBC. You asked in terms of why it came about. Well, a bit of background on English football at the start of the 1980s. English football was not in a good place at the start of the 1980s. Attendances had been falling for at least a couple of decades. Every season, there would be fewer fans than the season before. There were problems with hooliganism within the grounds, a lot of problems with racism on the terraces. And a lot of the football grounds themselves were quite decrepit. I mean, a lot of football grounds in England were built back in the 1920s, 1930s, and a lot of them hadn't been renovated. They were, not uncommon to go to a football match, and not only, we didn't have all-seater stadia back in those days. So you'd be stood on a terrace, and it wouldn't be unusual for there not to even be a roof on the stadium. So, if the weather, if it rained, you just got wet. So it wasn't a very attractive sport, really. It was losing a lot of followers, soccer in England in the early 1980s. People were being sort of pulled away by other things that were happening. A lot of people took up different sports, people went to play golf or what have you. There were other things you could do on a Saturday other than to go to the football match. And a lot of the violence, and as I mentioned, the racism, it turned people away from the game. And as a result of that, obviously money was coming out of the game, and the football authorities needed to come up with a way of thinking, well, how can we reinvigorate football in England? How can we bring the crowds back again? And interestingly, even though obviously England is the nation that sort of created modern football, if you like, what they did was, to their credit, was they started to look at what was going on in other countries. And they, obviously they looked to America, where obviously, you had Soccer Six, and how that was, what the rules were, how it worked. And they looked at America and said, well, let's give this a go in England. It works in America. It's very popular there. Let's bring it to England. Let's give it a go.
Defending champions Nottingham Forest won last season's Soccer Six final on penalties. Ronnie Fenton and Liam O'Kane have picked that starting lineup. I wonder if Brian Clough is watching at home. These 6 shooters from South East London can top up their total prize money to over £50,000 if they win this final, and that's quite big money for Charlton. In fact, it's equivalent to 3 times the amount they took through the gate when they played Nottingham Forest in their last home league game. Referee for the final is Joe Worrell. It's Charlton in grey, playing from left to right. And an indication of the commitment of these two clubs to the Soccer Six tournament for this Guinness top prize is that both chairmen are here. Maurice Roworth of Nottingham Forest and Michael Norris of Charlton Athletic, both in the crowd. Here's Steve Gritt down on the surface for Charlton. John Humphrey. Shirtliff. Gritt. Forest just grouping behind the ball. They've got to leave one man up, of course. That's Franz Carr. And quite good crowd involvement in this final, even though it's a southern team and a Midland side. Here's Gritt. Humphrey. This is Shirtliff. And Charlton starting by just stroking the ball around, keeping possession. This may be a chance for Mortimer. He turned nicely, good block by Darren Wassell. This is Gritt. Now Humphrey. It's going to go out to Paul Mortimer again. Steve Gritt. Oh, good save. Steve Sutton fingertipped that one away from Stevie Gritt. Good start to the final. And down there, waiting to come on, all the other players in these 10-man squads. Here's Humphrey. Wide again for Shirtliff, the captain of Charlton. Gritt. Oh, another one, and the same again from the goalkeeper. Leeburn goes in for the rebound.
And in terms of, you asked about, how seriously was it taken? Well, really quite seriously. They started off with a sort of pilot tournament for clubs in the Midlands of England, and that went well. And then they broadened it out into a competition for all of the top teams in England. And certainly, as you get towards the end of the 1980s, all the teams in England's top division, and we didn't have the Premier League then, but all of the teams that were in the Premier League now, every single one competed. So Liverpool, Arsenal, Manchester United, Chelsea, Manchester City, they all took part. And most teams, they sent their top players to take part in this. I think Liverpool were probably the only team, or one of the only teams, that they would send a squad which is sort of a mix of some of their best players and some of their more junior ones. But there weren't many clubs that did that. Most of them sent their best players. I remember when Alex Ferguson became Manchester United manager towards the end of the 1980s, he tried to win it with Manchester United and sent his best players, but failed. So it was taken very seriously. And you mentioned about whether there could have been a sort of competition between England and America in this, and I think that would have been wonderful. I think the English football authorities had big hopes for Soccer Six. I think whilst it was only ever held as a one-off annual tournament, they did have hopes that it would become more of a regional tournament, that you'd have a league that would go throughout the year, certainly involving clubs throughout all of the divisions in England, not just the top division. That was their hope for it, but it never quite came about, unfortunately, and neither did any international matches either.
And how about fans? I mean, and the press. I mean, did they kind of just look at this as a curiosity and not sort of, because I mean, you're mentioning some top talent, right, was playing, and they took it pretty seriously. And I got to think it had been a hell of a lot of fun. But obviously now it does have to be relegated to the tin pot category, but arguably maybe because it was more, just it came and went than it was necessarily not taken seriously. It sounds like it was. And some of the action looked like it was fantastic. I wonder if the fans took to it like, say, they did in the United States. Now, maybe not existentially. I mean, in the United States, the MISL, the indoor game, became really the only thing left after the collapse of the outdoor game. It became this sort of almost existential conversation about, well, the only version of the game that's really going to be that's have any staying power in the United States is going to be the indoor game. I doubt it came to that level in the UK or in England, but did fans enjoy it? Did the press take it seriously, or was it just this curiosity and let's have fun with it?
I think it was always seen as something that was more of a sort of a novelty, really. And quite often it was held in the sort of weeks coming up towards Christmas. And as I say, it was always a one-off annual event. So, and they had highlights, as I mentioned, on the BBC. So, yeah, I think everybody sort of got into it, really. And because it was it was only held once a year, and only for, it only took place over sort of 3 or 4 nights. It had this sort of novelty value, and for that reason alone, I think people just used to quite enjoy it. I think it was held in a number of different venues across England, both in Birmingham and in Manchester. It was always very well attended. So, in terms of crowds there on the day, it was televised, and certainly in England now, it's very fondly remembered by people who can remember football back in the 80s, and lots of discussions we had by fans going, "Well, why can't we have this back again?" Because it was just fun. It was fun. I mean, I think the footballers did take it seriously, and you can watch some of the highlights that are out there on YouTube, and certainly one match I remember watching there where the team conceded a goal, and there was a real inquest between the players on the pitch, finger pointing and jabbing as to whose fault it was because the goal had been conceded. So the players certainly took it seriously, and you can see when the team that won the tournament were given the trophy, there was plenty of celebration. So it did mean something to the players, and it was popular with the fans. And I think a lot of people in England would love to see Soccer Six come back. But what we're up against now, of course, is that certainly with Premier League players, they already played too many games, probably. So trying to fit something else into the schedule is probably impossible. But maybe it could be brought back for some of the lower divisions in England. No reason why that couldn't happen.
Yeah, I think that's actually a very a strong idea, and the game does kind of live on. I would say, arguably, in a much more minor league realm in this thing called the Major Arena Soccer League, and so it's still around. I mean, it does have its moments. Some of the legacy teams, brand names still live on and stuff. But yeah, that was those 1980s certainly in the U.S. and what you're describing. With Soccer 6 was just a really interesting time, and look in today's massively expanding professional sports landscape and all the money now that is part of it, both classically through, say, something like the Premier League and now the entry of private equity into lots of other things, including the hallowed NFL in the United States and the NBA in the United States. Doesn't seem to be any nobody seems to be satiated yet with new leagues and teams and offerings and sports, frankly. And I don't know. It feels to me, and we've talked about this before, that the quote unquote indoor game could see another more sustained, maybe more major oriented life down the road. And I think maybe we hinted at it, and we're not talking futsal with the no boards and stuff or beach, the beach version of the game and stuff. This is full on, indoor stuff. God forbid. I mean, I think it could be another international kind of thing, especially if other nations sort of took to it. But I get it, right? It's too many games, too much money at stake, and we'll see how long that lasts. But it would be great to see that stuff back. I think there are a lot of people in the States who would love to see the indoor game too.
Yeah, I think so, and I think yeah, and I'd love to see it on both sort of in England and yeah, why not at an international level? But yeah, I think it was. I suppose one of the problems that it came up against, that we come against now, is that indoors, when it was held in England in the 1980s, I think the most they could fit around the pitch was a couple of thousand, 2,000-3,000 people at most. And of course, it's more difficult to make the numbers add up financially, because obviously in the top Premier League games you can get 40,000-50,000 fans into a stadium, and obviously generate a lot more revenue than you can with an indoor tournament. But as I say, if it was for teams of lower down the pyramid, if you like, well, they may get crowds of 3,000 or 4,000 anyway. So it may well work for smaller teams.
Okay, so were there any in the putting together of these? I'm sure you learned about sort of competitions that you never heard of before, and obviously learned about a lot of stuff that you did or maybe thought you knew about before. Maybe I'm going to bait you in this question. Were there any tournaments that you subsequently have discovered or that you either missed or came across after the fact? Do you envision a second version of this book? And can I make some suggestions about 2 U.S. ones that perhaps could be part and parcel of such?
Okay, so it was interesting actually when I came up with the idea for the book. Initially, I didn't know whether there would be enough of these competitions to be the subject of a book. But it didn't take too much research, so I found out there were plenty of them. And I came across plenty of tournaments I'd never heard of before. And then it became a case of, well, which ones do I write about, and which ones do I leave out? And one of the ones that people keep asking me about, there was a competition in Europe called the Intertoto Cup.
That one I actually remember, even as an American soccer fan. I remember seeing that on some obscure Spanish language channels here. So yeah, indeed, let's hear about that.
Yes, I would say it's not covered in the book, but the Intertoto Cup. I mean, it was it was a European wide tournament that was held before the season started during the summer, and it was often used as a sort of a route for clubs to qualify for European competitions when they hadn't qualified through the normal routes. So, for example, to get in the Champions League in England, you have to finish in the top 4, whereas what the Intertoto Cup did was it gave teams that finished lower down the league another opportunity to try and get into a European competition. So if they could get into, one of the top places in the Intertoto Cup, because it was a curious tournament in that some years it didn't have a winner. It would have, because it was used as a qualifying tournament, it would have like 4 winners, but not one overall winner. So it was a very curious tournament, and the reason I never included it in the book was because it went on for quite a long time. And to be frank, somebody probably could write a book just about the Intertoto Cup on its own. It was too big a subject to try and shoehorn into the book that I wrote.
Well, I got two from the United States, and again, if you have a version 2, I would imagine there's probably a more than a few fans that are probably peppering you with all these sort of obscure sort of things. And look, there are plenty of one-offs, especially in the United States, right? We've almost sort of perfected the importation of teams from abroad in soccer to play even just a one-off match with some sponsor, like an airline or somebody, right? That then manufactures a cup. It's a one game, if you will, exhibition, but it counts as a cup, right? So it sounds like it fits in. Like I remember, for example, the Varig Cup, Varig Airlines in Brazil. I think it was like Brazil versus the United States, and it was a one-off match in Giant Stadium in the Meadowlands or something like that, or the Sabina Cup, right? Or airlines tended to do a lot of that kind of stuff. The Marlboro Cup in the United States, which was sort of an adjunct or a spinoff of the U.S. Cup. But let me give you two for just. I'm curious if you've heard of these or not. One is this thing that I remember vividly from the North American Soccer League, called the Transatlantic Challenge Cup. Now, this was the New York Cosmos usually hosting it, and it was always it was 4 club teams played during the middle of the USNASL, which is the summer, right? So then we're talking like Man City and Roma and Southampton and Napoli and Fiorentina and Udinese and Fluminense. So it was, and the Cosmos usually wound up winning. Sometimes the Seattle Sounders or the Chicago Sting did, but it was from the early 1980s, I think 1980 to 1984. And it was kind of the NASL's version of, I guess, sort of what now are these sort of European summer tours thing. And it was a way to embed a little mini competition in the midst of the NASL season. I don't know if you remember any of this or any of the teams of that, or if that's something that you're taking notes on now for another episode.
So I think, it does ring a bell, that tournament. I do. When I was doing my research for the book, that was one of the ones I came across. And as I said, when I was putting the book together, it was a case of having to decide which ones I was going to include and which ones I wasn't going to cover. And one of the sort of group of tournaments which I decided not to include was these sort of competitions that are generally held, and they're still held now, aren't they? During the sort of pre-season tournaments, they quite often will be sponsored by somebody. I think we've had the Audi Cup here in England and what have you. You have these tournaments, but they never really. The reason I never included them is because I don't think they were ever truly competitive competitions, in the sense that the purpose for them is just to train the players. Is to get the players fit for the new season. That's the purpose of them. And obviously, you bring a sponsor in because that's a way of generating more revenue. Whereas what I try to focus on in the book are tournaments that generally they did want to try and have a competitive tournament for in of itself, rather than just being having a pre-season tournament to get players fit and then trying to turn it into something more than it was. I mean, if we talk about Soccer 6, I mean, that wasn't held as it was held during the season, and it was held as a competition in its own right. It wasn't there just to get players fit or give experience to younger players. It was a tournament that was there to be won. It was designed to be competitive. It wasn't about as I say, just getting players fit for the new season. So that's why I sort of try, when I was looking at which tournaments should will I not cover, I did then sort of veer away from those sort of pre-season tournaments that probably aren't genuinely really competitive tournaments, in the sense that nobody's going to win a cup that they're going to remember. It's just about getting players for the new season.
Yeah, well, that's the burden, right, of creating a new category like you've done, right? You have to kind of now go back and define this stuff, right? Because you've discovered and or honed in on a new complete area of investigation and topic. I'll leave you with one other one, which frankly fits squarely into that definition. And I would actually make the argument that this was very competitive. And now this is the in the early 1960s here in the U.S. This is before the 1966 World Cup being broadcast live in the United States, which is a big event that kind of spurred on the subsequent founding of three that ultimately became two challenger professional leagues in 1967, the best of times, the worst of times. There was this thing called the International Soccer League here in the U.S. It was from 1960 to 1965, I believe. And it was literally a tournament held in the U.S. summer. And it featured many of the top teams internationally of the time playing in a competitive tournament in the United States, oftentimes without a U.S., if you will, participant. And it was a league. It was like a 3-month kind of thing. And it actually became foundationally, in the case of one of those two professional leagues in 1967, the model that actually wound up keeping the professional game alive for a number of years as the first pro leagues kind of sort of wilted and almost collapsed, was whole importations of international clubs to be renamed, if you will, at least for this multi-week period of time, for the localities that they were playing for. So, for example, Wolverhampton in 1967, playing in the United Soccer Association, one of those two pro leagues, became the quote-unquote LA or Los Angeles Wolves, even though that was fully the Wolverhampton Wolves. And I guess the issue in there is, number one, might be for your second version of the book. Number two, this was a really competitive kind of competition. It was, I would argue, was a much more intense version of if you will, preseason. But then number three is it actually was sort of this. Frankly, without this, I don't think pro soccer would have come so immediately after the World Cup in 1966 here, because there at least was this idea of how do you have competitive teams playing with each other in the United States, making it worth, and obviously the ethnic fan bases of lots of these countries were the predominant attendees of these matches. But it's a long-winded way of saying, have you ever heard of this International Soccer League? And is that something that either didn't make the cut or perhaps is might qualify, if you will, to be included down the road somehow? If not, we'd happy to point you to resources, because I don't know, some pretty interesting stuff there too.
Yeah, no, I have. Yeah, it was interesting you talk about the Wolverhampton Wanderers. I mean, that's a team that's not far from where I live, and I've heard about when they went over to the States and were renamed. It was still the same team, but they played under a different name. And I think, I may be wrong, but I think Manchester City may have done something, may have competed as well under a different name. And fascinating period of football history. Again, yeah, absolutely. Maybe something for another book. It's one of those things you look back now and it seems almost bizarre that these things could happen. You can't imagine it happening now at all. I'm glad you raised that one. That's a very fascinating period of football history.
All right, our thanks to Simon. And I must confess, in the preparation for this episode, I found myself going down many YouTube rabbit holes for some of those tournaments that we talked about. The Bicentennial Cup, for sure, in 1976. Some of the U.S. Cups that led into and just after the U.S. World Cup in 1994. And frankly, most fascinatingly, are the Soccer Sixes thing. I mean, as an indoor soccer fan, I was not even aware that they were playing this thing also in England in the 1980s. And I'm fascinated by how it was played there, the similarities and the dissimilarities, and frankly, why there wasn't any thought, perhaps, of why not to have perhaps some cross-continental tournaments, if you will, what was going on in the U.S. And England in the indoor game at the time. But I digress. More fascinating stories to be had in this book. It's called Tinpot, Football's Forgotten Tournaments, by Simon Turner, our guest this week. It is published by our friends at Pitch Publishing, and of course, it is available wherever you can find good books. And we'd appreciate it, of course, if you go to our website at goodseatsstillavailable.com and purchase it through that link there through Amazon. We'll get a couple of referral shekels of love. Helps keep our lights on and our bills paid. We'd appreciate that. But it's available in Kindle and paperback version. And of course, through our link to Amazon, you'll get it as fast as humanly possible, probably a little bit faster if you're a Prime member, I suspect. And we thank you for doing that. We also thank you for bookmarking our website at goodseatsstillavailable.com. That's where we post all of our episodes, as well as the ability to search. There's a nice search bar there. You can find a topic or a personality or somebody that you think that you'd be interested in, that we've maybe had a conversation about and over our 7+ years of existence. You can also share those with your friends, etc., get them excited about the show. But of course, the best way is to ensure that you get every single stinking episode we do the minute it goes out, is to subscribe or follow us wherever you get podcasts, for God's sakes. Go do that now if you haven't done that already. If you're following us on the socials, you'll find us on the Twitter X thing at Good Seats Still, and everywhere else, including YouTube, at Good Seats Still Available. While you're on the X Twitter thing, you can follow Simon as well. He is at Simon A, the letter A, Turner, Turner, Simon A. Turner 100. That's at Simon A. Turner 100 on the X Twitter thing. Our email address, feel free to send us some of that. We are at, hello at goodseatsstillavailable.com. There you go. And our pal Jerry Payne's audio excellence coming through bright and shiny again this week. Thank you, kind sir. And thank you, of course, for listening. Lots more fun to come in the weeks ahead. And we'll see you next week. Thank you. See ya.